So let's get into where I left off. We were talking about, I basically talked about scientific approach, the abstraction model, non-allness, non-identity, and I was getting toward non-elementalism. And non-elementalism, well, first let's just say elementalism, the Aristotelian version, whereas the non-Aristotelian version would be non-elementalism, is the idea that any word can have one true meaning, or it's this two-valued sort of logic where there's one, something's true or false, instead of the idea that, well, it might be true in one way, false in another, but there's so many different meanings to each word. Every word has so many possible meanings, and it really just depends on you to give that meaning. So this is breaking down now this old myth that was people sort of just unconsciously believed for a long time, until modern linguistics and semantics, and that's the idea of words as containers, that a word, like a container, can hold water. A word holds some meaning, and that the word in itself actually means something. So Charles S. Peirce, the philosopher, said, we don't get meaning, we respond with meaning. This is really a significant and important idea. If you think about it, it doesn't seem to us, if we haven't really thought about it too deeply, that it's difficult to distinguish between what we experience and the meaning that we ascribe to it, or that we project onto that experience. But it really is. If you think about it, I mean, I can't think of any sort of activity or behavior or response, any sort of reaction that we might have to our environment or to any situational thing, any situation we come into contact with, we're going to react and behave based on the meaning that we assign to this event. And Alfred Korzybski said, a person does what he does because he sees the world as he sees it. So maybe, a person with really self-destructive behavior has a self-destructive worldview, and they might not even be conscious of it, or, know that they can adjust or change that worldview. So that's the point here with this principle, is more consciousness of our evaluation again, and discrimination between what we experience and the meaning we attribute. And this metaphor of the map is just, let's just go back to that and just quickly review all these principles, because it's the perfect metaphor for describing all of these general semantics principles. Think about a map. A map doesn't show all of the territory. You could think of the Borges story of the map. They created the perfect, accurate map. It was so accurate that it covered the entire territory. But what's the point of that? Why live in an artificial reality when you can just step into the real reality? The point of the map, what makes it useful, is that it is limited. And then, I can take a napkin and draw up some directions with a few crude lines and dots or whatever, and that can show you the way to, for whatever the purpose is, where you're trying to get. And that is because Korzybski was saying that the maps are useful by virtue of their structural similarity. There isn't anything in the map that is the same as the territory, so how do they show us around? How do they, act as a tool for us in the territory? It's because though they limit, there's some structural relationship between this abstraction and what it's abstracting. And so, maps are tools and they help us, but if we're not conscious of their limits, then, like Marshall McLuhan said, we shape our tools and thereafter our tools shape us. We don't want our tool to be the only thing that guides our behavior or shape our behavior. So when you look at words, and Korzybski uses this example of, go into a dictionary and look at the definition of any word. It's going to be other words, and it goes in a circle. So you circularly define, so that dictionary rests on undefined terms that you just have to pick up through experience. So of course there are words that we can, say a word and point directly to something, and that'll give you an idea of what it is I'm talking about. But still, even in that case, there could be all types of different specific meanings that I might mean. So and think about how many words you can't point to. I mean, think about how many words there's no thing that you could just point to outside and say, this is what blah means. So these complexes, all these interrelated parts have meaning, not elementistically, not that they have meaning each in and of themselves, but like I forget his name, but like somebody to do with philosophy of language, but he said, words only mean things negatively, in the context of other words. So ultimately, meaning and, just this semantics rests upon a foundation of unconscious metaphysical assumptions, or at least if not unconscious, then unspoken, right? So Korzybski realized the only link between verbal and objective world is exclusively structural, necessitating the conclusion that the only content of all knowledge is structural. And this is why we can be at the forefront of this, the whole line of history, we can have more information than any other time in history, more access to information, and yet we're a giant group of idiots, and yet we're still destroying ourselves, each other, our environment. So again, Eastern philosophy talks about, just distinguishing between, no knowledge and intelligence, or however you would, however you want to say it, distinguishing between book knowledge and true knowledge. We could just imagine if you've ever read a book when you're 20 and then you read a book when you're 30, it's going to be a completely different book. And you might have looked up every word in the dictionary that you didn't know. You might have known the meaning of all the words, read the whole book, but then why does it take on a completely different meaning later? It's because, you've accumulated more experience, and, you're interpreting it differently. So that's the sort of spirit there that we're talking about with this principle of general semantics. So a successful map then is one which is most structurally similar to its territory. In other words, our language, Korzybski thought, should reflect our experience. The idealist philosopher George Berkeley saw that language was shaping opinions in this negative way, and he talks about that in his book, First Principles of Human Knowledge. But at the same time, maybe it's just because he's scared to, offend or shock anybody too much, but he basically says, we don't have to change the way we use words, but let's just realize, what we're doing here. And he says, quote, we should speak with the vulgar and think with the learned. Well, Korzybski doesn't agree. Obviously, he thinks we aren't capable of this, and we could see that by all the, the things we've been talking about, and sort of just look at mankind or humankind and, see what they can do, even if they have access to tons of knowledge. And this is something that Buckminster Fuller agreed with Korzybski about and would talk about a lot with his in his books, in his sort of philosophy of the world. He, for instance, talked about saying, once we realize we're not on a flat earth, we should change the way we speak. We shouldn't say we're going upstairs and downstairs. There's no down and up. We should take these words out of our language that will confuse us, so that we're unconsciously thinking in antiquated, ways, instead of updating our language to our experience, updating our map to the territory. And Alan Watts talked about this too. I mean, he thought that a big confusion or problem that Western people had with understanding Chinese thought, or a lot of Eastern thought, was that it was the basic structure of our language. One of the things, just that it's the subject predicate sort of structure, and the Chinese language doesn't have that. It doesn't say that there's what something is and then what it does. It's just what it does. So this is the direction that General Semantics is going to, trying to define things by what they do, operationally as we go along, defining things, redefining things, not thinking of things as having one static being or one thing that they are. And language that's embedded with, these little hidden assumptions is going to snag us up, and it's going to guide our behavior. And there's an example, I forget, one of the General Semantics guys, it's either on the Institute of General Semantics website or Steve Stockdale's website. I should really just look this up before I talk about it, but he was talking about a fish, this experiment they'd had where there's a big fish in a tank with little fish that it eats, and there's a glass wall separating them, and the big fish is hitting its head against the glass wall trying to get to the little fish to eat them. Eventually it realizes, I can't eat the little fish, and it gives up. And then they remove the glass wall, and it's still under the impression, this sort of unconscious sort of just assumption now, that he's not going to continue to test, that he can't eat the little fish, and so the little fish are swimming all around him, and he's not going for him. This is what happens when we have these sort of embedded, hidden, structurally dissimilar features of our language in ways that the map doesn't represent the territory. So yeah, if it's a non-Aristotelian system, but it's not anti-Aristotle. It's just updated. And it's open to further updates and change. So if you read Aristotle's his Ethics, the Nicomachean Ethics, a lot of the ideas are very similar to Korzybski's ideas, except they put into effect these principles that we've talked about. So Aristotle, he basically thought that the reason that, the problems that humans have with their behavior, the reason that humans will ever do stupid, irrational things is because basically they're just not acting human. And this is very similar to Korzybski. Aristotle defined man as the rational animal. So we're animals, but there's something more. We have this capability to be rational, but it's not the rule. It's just a capability that we can possibly have. And Korzybski took that, and instead of giving this abstract sort of definition, he gave an operational definition, which is we're time binders, and this is what that means. We accumulate information over time, pass it along. But it's interesting that you could see they both realized that while we have this capability of being rational or time binding, most people don't use this capability, or they don't ever develop this capacity within themselves. And as people start to, that's what Korzybski was saying would be the manhood of humanity, or whatever, the adulthood of humanity, as opposed to a childhood, that we aren't fully developed yet. We aren't fully evolved. We need to take conscious part in our evolution. And I think that these principles that he laid out will certainly help us towards that goal.